Forget the radiant smiles. Forget the gorgeous evening gowns or the prestigious golden Oscar statues. Do you know what Judy Garland, Joan Crawford, Raquel Welch, and a series of beauty icons of the 20th century have in common? All of them once sat on Johnny Carson's legendary sofa at The Tonight Show. And today, we will look through their thick layers of makeup and forced smiles to see a chillingly naked truth. Hollywood, the golden age, was actually a giant, gold-plated scandal den, a place where beauty was a type of currency. Notoriety was a payment method, and marriages were cold commercial contracts. They were forced to use strange pills, had to trade their dignity to get a decent role, and had to turn themselves into a sex symbol to satisfy the desires of the leaders. 8 chapters, 8 women, 8 different fates, but sharing the same tragedy. How much did they have to pay for a place under the halo? Fasten your seatbelts, because what you are about to read below will shatter the pink dreams about cinema that you once worshipped. Judy Garland, MGM's drug doll. December 17, 1968. The atmosphere at the NBC studio in New York had something different, heavier and more tense than usual. Johnny Carson, the man who always maintained the calmest, coldest demeanor, also could not hide his restlessness tonight. He continuously adjusted his tie, his eyes looking toward the wings with a rare anxiety. The band played the familiar melody of the song Over the Rainbow, but the audience's applause did not only carry eagerness, it was also mixed with a pitiful compassion. The person stepping out from behind the velvet curtain was not the innocent little Dorothy with the red shoes from years ago. It was Judy Garland at age 46, but she looked like a woman who had lived through 3 stormy lifetimes. Skinny, fragile as a dry leaf in the wind, hands shaking uncontrollably, and eyes lost, wild. To understand what Judy Garland had to go through, let me take you back in time, leaving the studio lights of 1968 to return to the dark 1930s at the Culver City studio. Here, Judy Garland was not considered a human being in the eyes of mogul Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM. Judy was just a profitable asset, a doll who knew how to sing and act. But this doll needed to operate continuously for 18 hours a day to shoot films, to earn millions of dollars for the studio. How could a teenage girl endure the workload of a slave like that? The answer is legal drugs. The MGM studio system established one of the most cruel and inhumane care regimens in history. In the morning, when Judy was so tired she couldn't open her eyes, the studio doctors, accomplices to the devil, would stuff into her mouth stimulant pills, which they beautifully called pep pills. It made her heart beat fast, her nerves excited, and she could dance and sing in front of the camera all day without knowing fatigue. But at night, when the stimulants were still taking effect, making her eyes stay wide open, they needed her to sleep to wake up early tomorrow to continue working. So they stuffed her with extremely strong sleeping pills to knock her out. That vicious cycle. Stimulants, sleeping pills, stimulants, sleeping pills, repeated over and over throughout her adolescence. MGM turned the body of a growing girl into a chemical laboratory, completely destroying Judy's biological clock and nervous system. But the darkness of the so-called Hollywood scandal den did not just stop at pills. It also lay in blatant personal violation. In her unfinished memoir, Judy once hinted at the dirty hands of the big bosses at the studio. Louis B. Mayer, the powerful boss to whom everyone had to bow, frequently called Judy into his office. He placed her on his lap, called her by the derogatory nickname, "My Little Hunchback," and calmly made indecent touches as if inspecting an item. Judy Garland was just a child then. She could not resist. She was taught that her life belonged to MGM, and pleasing the bosses was a part of that slave contract. If she resisted, she would lose everything: roles, money, and even her family, who also lived on her salary. Judy had to learn how to grit her teeth and endure those violations. In exchange for the silver screen halo, she was deprived of her childhood, deprived of the right to master herself, and turned into an emotionless money-making machine. Back to The Tonight Show. When Johnny Carson asked Judy about her current life, she tried to force a humorous smile, telling jokes. But that smile was so distorted and painful that it made the viewers have to turn their faces away. The audience in the studio laughed, but the laughter was awkward. They were witnessing the consequences of decades of abuse. Judy's body at this point was completely ravaged by alcohol and drugs, things she had been forced to use since childhood, and now she had become an addict to escape reality. Johnny Carson looked at her with the eyes of a helpless witness. He knew that he was interviewing a walking dead. The glitz of Hollywood, the rounds of applause, the Oscar awards, all became meaningless when looking at Judy's bony hands tightly gripping the edge of the table. Just 6 months after that fateful broadcast with Johnny. In June 1969, Judy Garland was found dead in a bathroom in London, caused drug overdose. She passed away at only 47 years old, but her body was as old as an 80-year-old's. Judy Garland's death was not an accident. It was a murder that lasted 3 decades, carried out by men in luxurious suits at MGM. They created a star, but they killed the person inside her, Johnny Carson, in his later hosting nights. Rarely mentioned her name again, perhaps because the obsession was too great. The image of Judy Garland on that sofa that year forever remains the most solid proof showing that, in Hollywood, women are not goddesses. They are sacrificial victims on the banquet table of power and ambition. Joan Crawford, The Transaction on the Tycoon's Chair. October 1st, 1962, a historic night. The lights at the NBC studio in New York were bright, but the air in the wings was thick with the smell of panic. Johnny Carson, the 37-year-old man with a handsome but anxious face, was standing there adjusting his tie for the 10th time. This was his first night officially taking over The Tonight Show. He was the newcomer, trembling as he stepped onto the throne. And to reassure the new king, Hollywood sent a Queen Joan Crawford. When Joan stepped out onto the stage, the whole studio seemed to hold its breath. At age 58, she did not walk. She moved like a tank wrapped in silk velvet, her perfectly tailored evening gown, her hair combed without a single strand out of place, and on her neck was a sparkling diamond necklace enough to buy an entire building. She sat down next to Johnny with her usual confidence, while Johnny Carson smiled awkwardly, trying to make jokes to hide his greenness. Joan Crawford sat there, quiet, majestic, and sharp-cold. But Johnny and the older audience members that night all felt a cold air radiating from this woman. That was not simple arrogance. That was the iron armor of a warrior who had waded through a sea of blood to survive. Johnny Carson was worrying about television ratings. Ridiculous. To Joan, that fear was just a child's game compared to the earthly hell she had to crawl through to have what she has today. Let me take you away from those brilliant colored lights of 1962, going back in time to a dark room, reeking of cheap cigarette smoke and the smell of men's sweat in Los Angeles in the mid-1920s. There was no illustrious Joan Crawford, only a poor, hungry young girl named Lucille LeSueur. Lucille did not come from velvet and silk. She came from laundries, from bottom-tier dance floors where men could have indecent touches with dancers for just a few spare pennies. Hollywood during the silent film era was a cruel flesh market, more ruthless and naked than any era. There were no labor protection laws, no unions, only fat bosses sitting behind desks and thousands of young girls ready to do anything to get on screen. In Joan Crawford's buried memories, there was a ghost named the Stag Films, private film reels screened privately at high society parties. The most haunting rumor, the thing that later Joan had to spend heaps of money to hunt down and destroy, was the fact that the young girl, Lucille, out of extreme destitution, once accepted to participate in sensitive film reels screened privately at high society parties. In those reels, human dignity was almost non-existent. There were only images of humans being turned into merchandise. But what made Joan Crawford different from other naive girls was that she did not cry. She did not consider herself a victim. She viewed seduction as a type of currency. Imagine this scene at the MGM office. A young Joan Crawford standing in front of Louis B. Mayer, the most powerful boss in the world. He looked at her with the eyes of a predator. He pointed to the leather-upholstered casting chair in the corner of the room, the place that had witnessed the humiliation of so many girls. But Joan did not tremble. She stepped forward, looked straight into his eyes, and executed a cold transaction. She gave them closeness, but she set a very high price. "I will help you achieve what you want, but you must make me a star. I want the best lighting, I want the best script, and I want my name at the top of the poster." While other actors had their lemons squeezed and peels thrown away by the bosses, passed around like toys, Joan Crawford used those very men as stepping stones. She built relationships with producers to get roles. She married Douglas Fairbanks Jr. to gain aristocratic fame. She manipulated Clark Gable to affirm her position as the Queen of MGM. She turned her heart into a cold block of stone, where love had no place. Only ambition was the sole religion. Back to the premiere night of 1962, when Johnny Carson looked into Joan's eyes. He saw fear. He did not just see a cinematic legend. He was looking at an extremely sharp woman who had hurted her own life. When her beauty faded and Hollywood intended to throw her away like expired merchandise, Joan executed her final coup, marrying Alfred Steele, president of Pepsi. When her husband died, she did not retreat. She stepped into the board of directors' meeting room, threatened the men in suits on Wall Street, forcing them to keep her as the image representative. She clung to power until her last breath. She sat there, back perfectly straight, smiling to teach Johnny how to look into the lens. But behind that smile was the past of the girl Lucille LeSueur in dark rooms. It was the calluses of a woman who had stepped over hundreds of power relationships to wear on her head the blood-stained crown. Shelley Winters, the confession of the one who used seduction to advance. If the history of The Tonight Show is a collection of polite and humorous moments. The night of September 26 that year was a sharp cut, tearing apart Hollywood's fake velvet curtain. Johnny Carson, the powerful man who always controlled everything on his chair, tonight helplessly witnessed a riot right on television broadcast. The guests that day were Shelley Winters, an actress who had twice won an Oscar. And next to her was Oliver Reed, a British actor famous for his masculine appearance, but also full of scandals about his alcoholism and rudeness. The atmosphere initially seemed normal, but the heavy smell of alcohol rising from Oliver Reed signaled a storm about to hit. When the conversation began, Oliver Reed, with drunkenness and the arrogance of a supreme white man, started dropping misogynistic remarks. He rambled on that smart women are a threat, that a woman's place is in the kitchen, serving and pleasing men. Johnny Carson, with the instinct of an MC, tried to steer the story elsewhere to cool things down, but he forgot who the woman sitting next to Oliver Reed was. It was Shelley Winters. She sat there, holding a glass of whiskey mixed with soda, eyes narrowing dangerously. Shelley was not Grace Kelly or Audrey Hepburn to sit still, smiling and enduring the insult in the name of politeness. Shelley Winters was someone who had grown up from the dusty streets of St. Louis, someone who had rolled around in the harsh flesh market of Hollywood for 30 years. She had once been a blonde bombshell scrutinized by studio bosses down to every centimeter of her appearance. She had heard enough of these condescending words from fat producers in high-walled, closed-gate offices. And tonight, she decided enough is enough. Before the stunned reaction of millions of American television audiences, Shelley Winters slowly stood up. She did not say a word. She picked up the glass of water on the table, coldly and decisively, dumped all of that freezing cold liquid onto Oliver Reed's head. At that moment, time seemed to stop. Johnny Carson's jaw dropped, the audience in the studio gasped in astonishment and then burst into applause. Oliver Reed, soaking wet and embarrassed, sat there like a plucked mouse. Shelley's action was not just a momentary angry reaction. It was a direct slap in the face to Hollywood's patriarchal system, where men gave themselves the right to determine the value of women. But the story of Shelley Winters did not just stop at that splash of water. Her rebellion originated from an experienced past that she never denied. Unlike female stars who always tried to build the image of a pure jade girl, Shelley Winters chose to admit the game. She openly talked about her relationships, about the men she had been attached to, about how she used her seduction and personality as a weapon to survive. On television broadcasts in the 70s and in her later shocking memoir, Shelley did not hesitate to list the list of her lovers like an achievement board: the wild Marlon Brando, the elegant William Holden, the masculine Burt Lancaster. She talked about them not with the tone of a lovesick woman, but with the tone of a hunter. Why should I be ashamed? She once challenged Johnny Carson when he blushed because of her overly naked stories. You men can use relationships to advance and be called ladies' men. As for me, I use my beauty to exchange for opportunities, to win roles, and I have 2 golden Oscar statues on my shelf. That is a fair exchange. Shelley Winters represented an earthly and straightforward perspective on glamorous Hollywood. She understood that in this world, innocence is a sin. She had been forced to lose weight, dye her hair, pad her breasts to compete with Marilyn Monroe. She had been considered second-class merchandise. But instead of letting that system crush her like Judy Garland, she learned how to turn the game around. She used relationships as ladders, stepping on them to step up to the peak of fame. The event on September 26, 1975 on Johnny Carson's sofa was the climax of that life philosophy. When she poured water on Oliver Reed's head, it was as if she wanted to declare, I may have had to trade a lot to survive in Hollywood, but I don't sell my self-respect to a drunk. Johnny Carson that night, despite trying to maintain his calm appearance, also had to give Shelley a look of awe and fear. He realized that this plump, noisy, and somewhat rude woman was the greatest survivor. She had gone through the hell of harsh casting calls, had tasted enough of the bitter taste of exchange, and she was still here, head held high, ready to punish any man who dared to look down on her. Raquel Welch, the tragedy of a walking decorative item. 1968 was a year of revolutions, of cultural changes boiling all over America. But at the NBC studio in Burbank, there was an archaic rule that was still firmly maintained, the rule of men looking at women. When Johnny Carson introduced the next guest, his voice deepened a bit, mixing the excitement of a man and the appreciation for an expensive work of art. And now, please welcome the most admired woman on the planet. Raquel Welch walked out. The entire auditorium seemed to stop breathing. At age 28, she was surrealistically beautiful. Bouncy brown hair, captivating big eyes. And most importantly, the thing the NBC cameras quickly aimed at were the curves that had become legendary. She did not walk like a human of flesh and bone, she glided like an illusion. But look closely into Raquel Welch's eyes that night. Behind the radiant, Hollywood standard smile was a high alert. She knew where she was stepping into. The sofa next to Johnny Carson, to her, was not a place to converse. It was a glass display cage. Raquel Welch came to The Tonight Show at a time when she had just shot up to become an A-list star thanks to the movie 1,000,000 Years BC. In that movie, she only had a few lines of dialogue, but the poster of her wearing a fur bikini was pasted in the bedrooms of millions of men all over the world. Hollywood had found the successor to Marilyn Monroe. But they did not find an actor, they found an image. Raquel's story is another typical example of the so-called harsh Hollywood backstage, but at a more sophisticated level than Joan Crawford's era. She was not forced into dark rooms to exchange career opportunities. She was forced to sell her sexy image to the public. 20th Century Fox Studios signed a contract with her not because of her acting talent, even though she was truly talented and very smart, but because of her body measurements. They turned her into an item of merchandise. They controlled how she dressed, how she walked, and forbade her from accepting roles that required too much inner depth for fear that the audience would forget to look at her appearance. Raquel Welch was deprived of the right to be a human being with intellect. She was simplified into a sex symbol. And on the television broadcast on June 19, 1968, Johnny Carson, whether intentionally or accidentally, became the enforcer of that objectification sentence. Johnny was a gentleman, always polite and charming, but he was also a product of that era. Throughout the interview, Johnny's questions and jokes continuously revolved around Raquel's appearance. He asked about the title sex symbol, about the feeling of being admired by millions of people. He looked at her, the audience looked at her, and the cameras zoomed in on her. Raquel Welch, in a desperate attempt to be recognized as a serious actor, tried to steer the story to work, to artistic intentions. But it seemed no one cared. Every time she talked about acting, the atmosphere sank. But every time she smiled charmingly or talked about seduction, the audience clapped rousingly. That was a public psychological torture. Johnny Carson did not have indecent actions, was not rude. But the way he and the whole world looked at Raquel was like how people look at a new model car or an expensive piece of jewelry. It was cold and emotionless. It sent the message, you just stay beautiful and keep quiet. We don't pay to hear you think. There was a passing moment that evening when Johnny gave a compliment about her figure. Raquel bowed her head and smiled, but her eyes darkened. She realized she was trapped. She was a prisoner of her own body. She had sold that bikini image to exchange for fame. To feed her 2 children as a single mother, a detail that Hollywood always hid away to keep her image as a single sex symbol. And the price to pay was that she was never allowed to grow old, never allowed to be ugly, and never allowed to be smarter than men. If Marilyn Monroe was a victim of innocence, then Raquel Welch was a victim of consciousness. She clearly knew the rules of the game. She knew she was being objectified. On Johnny's show, she had to play the role Raquel Welch, a seductive fictional character, while her true self was screaming inside that perfect shell. Raquel Welch deserves to be in this chapter because she represents the high-end merchandise of Hollywood. She was not thrown away after use like Jane Mansfield. She was preserved, polished, displayed in the most glamorous glass cabinet named The Tonight Show. But the essence still did not change in the eyes of the entertainment industry system. She was not a human being. She was a living mannequin making money. Lucille Ball, The Price of a Woman in Power. When Johnny Carson announced Lucille Ball's name, the audience at the NBC studio stood up and applauded endlessly. That was not the applause meant for a hot show girl. That was the respect meant for royalty. Stepping out onto the stage at age 62, Lucille no longer had the brilliant red hair of the silly wife Lucy Ricardo from years ago. She wore glasses, dressed elegantly, and most importantly, she exuded an authority that made even Johnny Carson, the most powerful man on television, have to adjust his sitting posture. Johnny looked at her not with the eyes of a man looking at a woman, but with the eyes of an employee looking at the general boss. Why? Because Lucille Ball was not just a comedian. She was the first and only woman in Hollywood history who dared to stand up to run a major film studio, Desilu Productions, the place that produced billion-dollar brands like Star Trek or Mission Impossible. But that night, behind Lucille's thick glasses and professional smile, Johnny and the subtle audiences still recognized a hardness to the point of austerity. That was the scar of a woman who had to turn her heart to stone to survive among a pack of wolves. The story of Lucille Ball is a completely different perspective on the harsh backstage of Hollywood. She did not use seduction to exchange. She used the intellect and decisiveness of a businesswoman. Back to the 50s, when the whole of America laughed tiltingly at the image of the silly Lucy on TV backstage, Lucille Ball was the most sober person. She realized that Hollywood considered actors as single-use tools in order not to be eliminated. She and her husband, Desi Arnaz, founded their own empire. She was the rare woman who dared to step into the board of directors' meeting room, slam the table and give orders to the men wearing suits, the ones who originally only considered women as secretaries or companions. But Lucille's tragedy lay in that very success. The Hollywood system did not accept a woman more powerful than her husband. Desi Arnaz, the man she passionately loved, could not bear the overly large shadow of his wife. And Desi fell into the exact eternal trap of Hollywood men: alcoholism and scandalous relationships. While Lucille worked exhaustingly 20 hours a day to run the studio and act in films, Desi was immersed in lavish parties with many young, beautiful girls, the newly rising faces of the entertainment industry. Lucille knew everything, but because of the image of the golden couple, because of the Desilu empire, she had to swallow her tears inside. She had to play the role of a happy wife on television broadcasts every week. While her heart shattered every time she went home, she had to fire her own husband from the executive position to save the company. At that moment, she was no longer a wife. She had become a cold, female boss. On the sofa of The Tonight Show in 1974, when Johnny Carson asked about her illustrious career, Lucille answered crisply, sharply, without a bit of excess. She talked about filming techniques, about human resource management, about discovering new talents. There was not a bit of flirtation or seductiveness. She shattered the prejudice that women went on TV only to show off their appearance. But the respect Johnny reserved for her was also tinged with loneliness. Lucille Ball sat there like a lonely monument. She had defeated the system true. She owned the studio true. But to do that, she had to sacrifice her personal happiness, had to divorce the man she loved most, and had to become so thorny that no one dared to come near. In Lucille's eyes that night, people saw the tiredness of a general after a war. She proved that, in the harsh backstage of Hollywood, if women want to hold power, they must pay the price by killing the softest part inside their human self. They must become harder than even the men around them. Zsa Gabor, The Public Price Haggling, performance right on television broadcast. 11:30 at night. The theme music, Johnny's theme, had just ended. Johnny Carson stepped out with his usual confident look. But tonight, observant audiences would see he was a bit restless. He continuously adjusted his suit jacket button and tapped his pencil on the table, a sign showing he was preparing to face a natural disaster. And that natural disaster was named Zsa Gabor. When Zsa glided out onto the stage, she did not look like a guest. She looked like a mobile jewelry store. Heavy strings of diamonds on her neck, on her hands, and even on her earrings, swaying to each breathing rhythm, emitting blinding rays of light under the studio lights. She sat down. The smell of expensive perfume strongly scented a whole corner of the studio, completely overpowering Johnny's smell of cigarette smoke. If Judy Garland came here to cry, Joan Crawford came to give orders, then Zsa Gabor came to set a price. Right from the first second, She turned the interview into a fame-trading floor. She did not talk about movies. She leaned toward Johnny, her thickly lined eyes blinking, and dropped an opening sentence in a coquettish Hungarian voice. "Johnny, darlings, you look very delicious tonight, but this tie is too cheap." Johnny Carson, the most powerful man on television, suddenly blushed red like a poor schoolboy being criticized by a rich girlfriend. That was exactly Zsa's tactic: lower the man to raise her own price. The peak of this charming brazenness is an anecdote that until now people still debate whether it was actually broadcast or not. But it encapsulates the nature of their relationship. Zsa brought onto the stage a pure white Persian cat. She stroked it right on her lap, looked straight at Johnny, and asked a question full of humorous implication. "Would you like to pet my pussy?" The whole studio held its breath. Johnny Carson froze in a split second, but instead of being confused, he replied with a counterattack that went into history. "I'd love to, but you have to remove that damn cat first." Laughter exploded in the studio. But behind that laughter was a naked truth. Zsa Gabor was publicly teasing with full implication, and Johnny was cleverly replying. They were acting out a play about repartee and fame right in front of millions of American audiences. Zsa Gabor is the embodiment of a type of marriage accepted by high society, marriage of a beneficial nature. She did not hide that. When Johnny mockingly asked, "Zsa, how many husbands have you had?" she did not show any embarrassment at all. She raised her hand full of rings up to admire and replied nonchalantly, "Do you mean my own, or counting other people's too?" Then she added the most famous saying, the life manifesto of a high society lady. "I am a wonderful housekeeper. Johnny, every time I leave a husband, I keep his house." In the dark Hollywood world that we are dissecting, Zsa Gabor was the smartest person. She knew beauty had an expiration date. Instead of letting the studio bosses squeeze the lemon and throw away the peel like Marilyn Monroe or Judy, she actively turned herself into a luxury character. She did not attach herself to men for a petty role. She attached to them to exchange for villas, stocks, and diamonds. On the sofa of The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, she taught Johnny and the audience a cruel lesson. Love in Hollywood is a game for poor people. Rich people play contract games. Every time Johnny Carson tried to expose her gold-digging habit with jokes, Zsa laughed loudly and admitted it immediately. Her honesty made people unable to hate, but on the contrary, feel awe and fear. She showed that if you build an image expensive enough, people will call you a lady. Bette Davis, the one who declared war on the Hollywood brothel. In the history of The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, there were guests who made Johnny Carson excited. There were those who made him blush. But there was only one woman who made him walk on eggshells. It wasn't a fear of power, but absolute reverence for a grand dame, the only person who dared to look straight down the camera lens and blow smoke in the face of all of Hollywood. Johnny Carson didn't give a long introduction. He only needed to say 2 words, "Bette Davis." That was enough. The entire audience rose for a standing ovation. The applause didn't have the frantic, screaming energy reserved for rock stars. It was long, deep, and steady, like waves crashing against a cliff. It was the sound of respect for the ultimate survivor. Stepping onto the stage at 74, Bette Davis no longer had her brisk stride. A previous stroke and a battle with cancer had ravaged her body. But the moment she sat down in the chair, a miracle happened. She pulled a pack of cigarettes from her purse, and with a chillingly decisive motion, she lit up. A thin wisp of gray smoke rose, drifting idly between them. Johnny Carson, a man who famously hated anyone smoking on his show except himself, did what he quietly pushed a crystal ashtray in front of her, as obedient as a busboy. Bette Davis took a drag. her famously bulging eyes narrowing as she scanned the studio. That look seemed to say, "I'm still alive, you bastards." To understand why Bette Davis's appearance carried such tremendous weight in this Hollywood brothel dossier, you need to know who she was in the past. If Marilyn Monroe or Jane Mansfield were commodities displayed in a glass case, Bette Davis was the one who took a hammer and smashed that glass case to pieces. In the 1930s and 40s, movie studios like Warner Brothers operated much like glorified slave camps. Moguls like Jack Warner held the power of life and death. They dictated what actors ate, what they wore, and who they worked with. If you were beautiful, you had to be eye candy. If you were stubborn, they would drown your career. Bette Davis wasn't beautiful in a porcelain doll kind of way. She was even disparaged by Jack Warner himself as an ugly duckling during her very first audition. But instead of kissing up to the boss for a role or getting plastic surgery to please the male gaze, Bette Davis did the unthinkable. She sued the studio. She was the first actress to stand before a high court, point right in the faces of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry, and scream, "I am an artist, not a slave." Even though she lost the lawsuit on legal grounds, she won in sheer guts. She forced Hollywood to reevaluate the worth of women. Back to that night in 1983 on Johnny Carson's couch. Bette Davis's voice by then was thick and raspy, sounding like gravel grinding together. She didn't come for small talk. She came to school them. When Johnny asked her about her illustrious career, Bette didn't bring up Oscars or rounds of applause. She talked about the battles. She recounted how she once forced makeup artists to make her look as haggard, sickly, and ugly as possible in the film of human bondage. Why was that important? Because in the Hollywood fame market, where women lived and died to be beautiful. To secure the public's attention, Bette Davis's deliberate act of making herself ugly was a declaration of war. She wanted to prove that talent was eternal, while beauty was just a highly perishable good. There was a hair-raising moment during the interview when Johnny Carson brought up the name Joan Crawford, Bette's sworn enemy. The audience held their breath, expecting a catfight, a stereotypical catty remark. But no, Bette Davis just smirked, a smile that was half pity, half contempt. She didn't hate Joan Crawford out of jealousy. She hated her because Joan was a compromiser in Bette's eyes. Joan Crawford represented everything she despised about the old system, the phoniness, using personal connections to get ahead, and the sick obsession with maintaining a star image. She did whatever it took to become a star, Bette had once said. She didn't repeat that exact phrase on the show, but her attitude that night implicitly reaffirmed it. And me, I climbed to the top on my own scarred legs. Johnny Carson looked at the woman sitting in front of him, shrouded in cigarette smoke, and he realized a bitter truth. The obedient women he had interviewed, the dreamlike beauties. The sex symbols mostly met tragic ends. Some committed suicide, some succumbed to addiction, some were simply forgotten. Only Bette Davis, the difficult one, the ugly one, the brawler, was still sitting there, at age 74, sharp and proud as a monument. She was the most eloquent proof of one rule. If you want to survive in the slaughterhouse called Hollywood, you cannot allow yourself to become a prime cut of meat. You have to become the hardest bone to swallow. You must be willing to be hated, to be isolated, as long as you never sell your soul to the devil. Elizabeth Taylor, the price of being the world's most expensive toy. Forget the $1 million diamonds. Forget the glamorous Cleopatra. Look at the scars. On Elizabeth Taylor's body lay a map of Hollywood tragedies, over 70 hospitalizations, agonizing back surgeries, near-death experiences with pneumonia, and the emotional wounds of 8 broken marriages. She wasn't a starlet raised in a glass cage. She was a warrior who had dragged herself across the battlefield of fame, where women were usually priced by their beauty and discarded when it faded. February 21, 1992. This wasn't just an ordinary evening. These were the final days Johnny Carson sat on the throne of The Tonight Show before his retirement. The atmosphere was tinged with farewells. And there was no one more worthy to see him off than Elizabeth Taylor, the ultimate queen. The last surviving witness of what they called the Golden Age. When she appeared, the audience didn't scream wildly like they would for pop stars. They fell silent. Elizabeth Taylor, at 60 with her signature big hair, had a weak, whispering voice. Yet she still exuded a bewitching magnetism from those legendary violet eyes. Johnny Carson looked at her, and in the eyes of the king of late night that evening, there was no teasing, no flippant flirting like he'd had with Zsa Zsa Gabor or Raquel Welch. There was only understanding. Two old dinosaurs looked at each other, knowing the meteor was about to hit and their era was coming to an end. Why is Elizabeth Taylor the perfect conclusion to this Hollywood brothel dossier? Because she was the greatest victim of the illusion of love in a world of transactions. Unlike Joan Crawford, who sought power through relationships, or Zsa Zsa Gabor, who married for money, Elizabeth Taylor married because she was afraid of being alone. She stepped into Hollywood as a child, had her every breath controlled by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and was robbed of her childhood. She grew up with the warped belief that a woman's only value was in being desired and noticed by men. She dove headfirst into 8 marriages with 7 different men, not because she was promiscuous. She clung to them like a drowning person clutching a lifeline. She was searching for a father, a protector, someone who could shield her from the cruelty of public opinion and the pressure of the studios. But Hollywood was a ruthless meat market. The men who came to her, some did so for her fame, like Nikki Hilton. Some developed violently jealous complexes over her massive shadow. Some died young, like Mike Todd. She loved passionately, gave her all, only to receive public humiliation in the tabloids in return. On Johnny Carson's couch that night, Elizabeth didn't talk about the roles of a lifetime. She talked about the pain. She talked about her battle against alcohol and painkillers, the things she used to numb the feeling of being used. She talked about establishing her HIV/AIDS Foundation, where she poured all her remaining love into people marginalized by society, much like how she felt Hollywood had turned its back on her when she gained weight or grew older. Johnny Carson, the man who had interviewed thousands of beauties, suddenly became extraordinarily tender that night. He held her hands covered in diamond rings, yet frail and trembling. He realized that those diamonds weren't boastful jewelry. They were the cold armor Elizabeth Taylor draped over herself to hide the wounds that had never healed. Their conversation was a swan song for an era where stars were distant gods, beautiful but full of tragedy. Johnny Carson was about to leave, leaving behind an empty chair. Elizabeth Taylor, too, would eventually recede into the shadows of illness. As the show drew to a close, Elizabeth Taylor planted a soft kiss on Johnny's cheek. It wasn't a sensual kiss, but the kiss of 2 old soldiers surviving a war. She stood up, with difficulty but with pride, and walked into the wings. But the old footage from The Tonight Show remains, acting as the most damning evidence. Johnny Carson's couch wasn't just a place for chatting, it was the witness stand. There, beneath the glamorous veneer of laughter and applause, we got to see the true price of fame. It was a cutthroat flesh market where beauty was appraised, love was commercialized, and human souls were put up for bargaining. They might have been victims, accomplices, or warriors, but all of them were great women who survived the storm to tell their stories. Leave your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to hit follow, as we will continue to step away from the limelight together and venture deep into the shadows of Hollywood's darkest secrets.